Sometimes people experience a spontaneous movement of energy that feels like there's something rising up their spine and stopping at different levels along the way. This experience happened to me while tripping on LSD for the first time, and it left me really confused initially. And I'm not the only one who's experienced something like this. It's been happening to people for who knows how long. The weird thing is, this isn't some simple placebo effect. This is happening to people who have never heard of a Kundalini Awakening or chakras. So a lot of you are probably just curious what it is. So that's what we're going to be exploring in this video. One time I was looking through Reddit and I came across this thread that said, "Are chakras BS?" It's a valid question. Talking about chakras often sounds really silly, and it's an easy target for people to make fun of.
They're either incredibly high, which they definitely are, or they're incredibly tapped in spiritually, which they definitely think they are.
I'm a pretty skeptical person, so even I had my doubts about it, even after having a life-changing Kundalini experience. But after you have more than like a dozen of these experiences where you feel the energy rising up the spine and through the chakras, you know that there's at least something going on there. So let's dive into this. As it turns out, there's not actually that much information about Kundalini. For this video, I had to do a lot of digging and see what I can learn about the origin of this subtle body system. The original writings about this are in Sanskrit, so they've been subject to misinterpretation and watering down over the years. The Merriam-Webster definition of Kundalini says, Kundalini is the feminine form of the Sanskrit adjective meaning circular or coiled. In yoga, the word applies to the life force that lies like a coiled serpent at the base of the spine, and that can be sent along the spine to the head through prescribed postures and exercises, or acid. On the way, the Kundalini passes through 6 chakras, or points of physical or spiritual energy in the human body. At the 7th chakra, the yogi is said to experience enlightenment. So what are the chakras? I found a really good definition for them on this blog that I read. It might be the best definition of them that I've ever heard. Chakras are focal points for meditation within the human body, visualized as structures of energy resembling discs or flowers at those points where a number of nadis, channels or meridians, converge. They're conceptual structures, yet are phenomenologically based, since they tend to be located where human beings experience emotional and or spiritual energy, and since the form in which they are visualized reflects visionary experiences had by meditators. That's the best definition I've ever heard, so I'm glad I did the research for this video because I think that just sums it up perfectly. Something else to consider is that there are several systems that have different numbers of chakras. This is just the one that has become dominant, but some other systems have 5 chakras, 6 chakras, some as many as 144 chakras. The origin of the idea of chakras originates with Tantric Yoga, which came to prominence between the years 600 and 1300 AD. And Tantric Yoga is still practiced to this day. The 7 chakra system, which we use today, became dominant in the 1400s. The first text that I could find out about that writes about the 7 chakra system is called the Sarada Tilaka, and it was written in the 1200s. And there are more elaborate texts written about this system in the 13 and 1400s. But the text where most of the West got its ideas from about Kundalini is from an author named Purnananda Yati. It was called Explanation of the 6 Chakras, and it was written in 1577. And I know I was talking about 7 chakra systems, but this is that same system. Technically speaking, they considered 6 to be within the body and the 7th chakra to be outside of the body. So that's why it says 6. It came out in 1577 and it was translated into English in the year 1918. The author of the article I was reading this from says the English translation was somewhat incoherent and confusing. So off to a great start of trying to translate these ideas into the Western world. With that said, I want to refer back to a video I made during Psychedelic Week where I read a quote from this same article, and it's talking about interpreting the chakras. So I think it's important, so I'm going to play that clip right here. This might be the most important point. English sources tend to present the chakra system as an existential fact, using descriptive language like the Muladhara chakra is at the base of the spine and it is red, and so on. But in most of the original Sanskrit sources, we're not being taught about the way things are, we're being given a specific yogic practice. We are to visualize a subtle object made of colored light, shaped like a lotus or a spinning wheel, at a specific point in the body, and then activate mantric syllables in it for specific purposes. The texts are prescriptive. They tell you what you ought to do to achieve a specific goal by mystical means. When the literal Sanskrit reads, in its elliptical fashion, 4-petaled red lotus at the base of the body, we are supposed to understand the yogi ought to visualize a 4-petaled lotus. And I think this is important to consider because whenever you hear things like, this crystal is associated with the solar plexus chakra, that is mostly a Western invention. I think stuff like that can be a useful meditation tool, but it should not be considered descriptive of the chakras. Dealing with the energy body is an extremely fluid process, and depending on what kind of meditation or visualization you're doing, you can experience other kinds of energy structures. For example, I've also experienced the energy centers called Dantian, which is used in Buddhist meditation practices. And if it was a chakra, it would be somewhere in between the second and third chakras. So none of this is fixed. Having said that, there are a few energy centers that appear across all of these systems. One would be the lower belly, the other one is the heart, and then the other one is the crown. These are the 3 places in the body in which humans all over the world experience emotional and spiritual phenomena. Some features of the chakras in the original texts are each chakra has their different associated lotuses with a specific number of petals. Each leaf on the petal has an associated mystical sound of the Sanskrit alphabet, like Om. The first 5 chakras are associated with the great elements: root chakra earth, sacral chakra water, solar plexus fire, heart chakra wind, and throat chakra space. I find these associations of the chakras and the elements to hold up, and they match and resonate with my own experiences of the different levels of consciousness associated with each chakra. They also originally meditated on different deities for each chakra, and I think it's interesting that that's one of the things that didn't carry over into the modern interpretation of the practice. I'm going to read another excerpt from this writer who I've been reading from, and they're talking about this practice of deities. Clearly, this practice is embedded in a culturally specific context in which the sounds of the Sanskrit language are seen as uniquely powerful vibrations that can form an effective part of a mystical practice that brings about spiritual liberation or worldly benefits through magical means. Invoking the image and the energy of a specific deity into a specific chakra is also culturally specific, though if Western yogis come to understand what those deities stand for, the practice could potentially be meaningful for them as well, though probably never as meaningful as for someone who grew up with those deities as paradigmatic icons emblazoned on their subconscious minds. So the gods and goddesses associated with each chakra, starting from the root, is Ganesh, Brahma, Vishnu, Rudra, Isvara, Sadasva, and Bhairava. A lot of people who talk about the chakras sound extremely silly. They're making claims to authority based on less than favorable translations of extremely complicated original Sanskrit sources. But at the same time, myself and others have had unmistakable visionary experiences dealing with the energy in these chakras and rising up the spine. So I can't speak from any kind of authority, but I can share with you what I've experienced and what I've learned. So I think it's important that we all speak with a little more humility when it comes to the chakras and have less claims to authority. There's always a chance of some priming going on, which is basically a type of placebo effect where when you expect to see something, it affects what you do see. This can be true during psychedelic trips. Some imprint that had been made on your mind comes to the forefront of your experience. However, the experience I had of Kundalini energy rising up the spine and the experiences of other people have happened to us by total surprise, with nobody knowing that this type of thing even existed. So it just feels like it's impossible that I could have been primed for this. Maybe some of the later ones, but not that first experience. Just for an example, when I had my Kundalini experience, it started in the center of my belly, and it felt like there was some kind of fire or glowing energetic mass inside of my stomach, but it did feel very fire-like, and that's the associated element with that chakra. So stuff like that just kind of checks out. So we've been talking about the chakras for a while. I want to zoom back out and talk about the overall rising of energy up the spine. One of the things that I've experienced a few times is this energy rising up the spine, and it kind of wiggles in this serpentine-like pattern. You feel like you could almost move along with it, and according to the mythology, the Kundalini is a coiled serpent at the base of the spine that rises to the top. Through Kundalini and yoga and tantric practices, or in my case LSD, the energy can rise up the spine, hitting a series of different chakra centers and eventually getting to its home in the crown chakra. When this energy reaches the crown, you experience a profound spiritual awakening and transformation. This experience changed my life, and it's one of the reasons that I'm not just casual about this psychedelic stuff. I'm obsessed with it. Kundalini as a whole is associated with some kind of vital life force energy, your source of energy and vitality, as well as connecting you to the divine feminine of the cosmos. I like to think of Kundalini Shakti as the god-goddess of the universe, where it actually is the universe itself. One of the things associated with a Kundalini awakening is the uniting of the masculine and feminine within a single person. And this is interesting because it kind of goes against the grain of the typical binary way of thinking about masculinity and femininity. And it's not that someone would become 50% androgynous all of the time, but it's like, let's say you're a masculine oriented person, it's being more in touch with your feminine side and things like that, where it's more of incorporated rather than some exact middle ground.
Man at his birth is supple and tender, but in death he is rigid and hard. Thus suppleness and tenderness are the marks of life, and rigidity and hardness the marks of death. Tao is always gentle, you see, always yielding. It is feminine, in a way. Lao Tzu says, although you may be a male, always have a certain feminine quality, and thus you will become a universal channel. That has particularly to be learned by men in the United States, who tend to overcompensate masculinity, to be ashamed of gentleness.
And the same goes in the reverse. I think humans incorporating both energies is part of our evolution. The masculine and feminine energies are not oppositional. It's all part of the human spectrum as a whole, and maybe of the universe. I want to talk a little bit about the possibility of what's called spiritual emergencies. Some Kundalini experiences happen spontaneously, like it did for me. And I really felt like I wasn't properly grounded or have the right foundation to handle this intensity. And because of that, it actually led to some forms of suffering and struggle because I wasn't properly ready for it.
These have been clearly listed down in ancient Sanskrit works on Tantra. I must tell you that there are also cautionary warnings that if not handled properly, activating these energy centers might lead to an imbalance in prana, which is really hard to rectify.
It was mixed in with this taste of enlightenment. It was a lot to happen at once. Some people report feeling physical pain in the area of the chakras, but that never happened to me, so I'm not sure about that one. I just think that's worth mentioning, that there are possible side effects to all of this stuff. It's not very well understood, but for some people it seems like when they have these experiences that are super spontaneous and they're not really ready for it, that it can have these negative manifestations. Thankfully, I feel like I got past that, and one of the big ones for me was grounding. That is going to be your absolute foundation. So I recommend, if any of you become interested in Kundalini practices, I would recommend really focusing on your grounding. I talk about a few ways to do that in my Psychedelic Week video for day 1. This idea of Kundalini Shakti, the god, goddess of the universe, has pretty much replaced the idea of God for me. It's nothing dogmatic, it's entirely based on my own experiences, and it feels closer to the truth for me than anything I've ever found, even if it's still pretty fuzzy and mysterious. This is still mostly uncharted territory, and although this hasn't been proven by science, I strongly do feel that something is going on here. So I think it's important for anyone dealing with this, like me, to never imply that we know anything with certitude. I don't claim to truly know anything about this with 100% certainty. If we develop beliefs like I have, let's hold them gently as we continue to learn. Remember, keep your mind open. Well, that was a super fun deep dive, y'all. I hope y'all learned something from this. I definitely did too. If you want to hear more about individual chakras, I did a whole Psychedelic Week video where every day was a different chakra and a different theme. So check out the playlist for that, and there's plenty of stuff to binge there. And if you haven't already subscribed, of course that would be super solid. If you want to help me out, that would be great. And of course like the video, but I know some of y'all are doing that already, so I super appreciate everyone who watches these videos, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Peace.